apart from people like yourself, almost nobody knows anything about it. So what would you say is their message to us today, right now? I mean, if you were their bridge to bring us their message, what is it they've got
you know,
for our world?
I think the message is the same message you tell your kids. I mean, don't soil your own sandbox. You know, stop destroying the rivers. You know, stop polluting the seas. I mean, it's so incredible. You go, I mean, I was doing a film on Polynesian navigation, and we were in the most remote reaches of the Marquesas, you know, which is probably as remote as any place you can go in Polynesia. And, you know, here we were walking through a landscape of ancient, monumental architecture, pristine beaches, you know, where in the Marquesas there's not a major international airport, there are virtually no hotels, and yet the beaches were just utterly littered with garbage, plastic. You know, you have these islands of waste floating out in the ocean that are like little countries of garbage. You have areas at the mouth of rivers that are dead zones. You know, you just wonder how people can be so short-sighted. You know, and I go back to this idea that you know, the most frightening quality of our species is the fluidity of our memory and our capacity to forget. You know, this was probably an adaptive trait when we were social species on the Serengeti Plain. Now it can become our downfall. In other words, you know, I remember, for example, I did a lot of work in Haiti, and Haiti in the 1920s was still virtually 60, 70, 80% covered with one of the richest neotropical dryland forests in the Antilles. Now the forest covers about 2%. And I was looking out over this sort of valley of scabrous second growth trees, and this voodoo priest I was with began to wax eloquent as if words alone could squeeze something beautiful, you know, from that sight. And he could only think of angels, I could only think of locusts. You know, he did more honor to the human spirit, I was more accurate in terms of science. And what I realized is that, you know, the people of Haiti, within a single generation, they've just adapted to a landscape that is virtually without soil, without trees, you know, and that will never again know the comfort of shade. And, you know, not long after that, I went on a kind of a pilgrimage, by inadvertent pilgrimage, when I was doing a lecture tour, and I visited 2 universities that allowed me to go to 2 of the great kind of sites of ecological tragedy in this country, in North America. And one was a patch of woodland on the banks of the Green River in Ohio, which was the site of the last great nesting flock of passenger pigeons. Now, people your age, my age, don't remember that, you know, in the late 19th century, passenger pigeons made up 40% of all birds in North America. Flocks were so abundant that Audubon described what he estimated to be 2 and 3 billion birds forming clouds that eclipse the sun over Cincinnati. From the height of the, when flocks like that would land on woodlands, trees would break open from the weight of birds. Summer landscapes became winter landscapes with the amount of guano. And from the height of those populations to their final extinction was a generation. And it's because pigeon meat was a mainstay of the American diet. Gentlemen hunting clubs or shooting clubs in New York would catapult as many as 50,000 live pigeons to their death until diminishing supplies forced us in skeet shooting to use clay pigeons. The term in English, a stool pigeon, derives from a killing technique of the era. You'd capture a bird, sew its eyelids shut, tie it to a pole, put the pole on the ground, and its cries would attract the other birds that could be batted out of the sky with poles. You know, and then I went from there to a patch of tall grass prairie in Iowa, where a young botanist took me through this tired field in the winter, and you know, he was sort of focused on the plants. I could only think of the horizon and the physics of waves when buffalo used to move through this ecological formation, which once carpeted the central part of this continent from Manitoba south to Texas. And in 1871, buffalo outnumbered people in North America. You could stand on a bluff in the Dakotas and see herds that had areas the size of Rhode Island. You know, they would take days to pass by a single spot. And from the height of the population of the buffalo to its final reduction to a zoological curiosity wasn't a century, and it did not come about as a consequence of the inexorable progression of the American frontier. It happened in 7 years. It was explicit policy of the U.S. cavalry after the Civil War to exterminate the buffalo and thus exterminate the Indians. And when Philip Sheridan, who led the campaign, the Civil War general, when the last of the buffalo was reduced to a curiosity, when the last of the Great Plains cultures were reduced to the reservations, he actually recommended to the U.S. Congress that a commemorative medal be minted that would have on one side of it a dead buffalo, on the other side a dead Indian. You know, and this was a way of things in the lifetime of my great-grandfather. And for the people of Iowa, at the time of the buffalo, let alone the time of the Great Plains cultures, is as distant to their lives and as irrelevant to their lives as the fall of Rome or the Battle of Troy. And yet it happened within the lifetime, in some cases, of their grandfathers and mothers, you know. And this fluidity of memory, this capacity to forget, is really frightening. I mean, now the people of Iowa, famously good and decent people, live in a landscape that is positively claustrophobic in its monotony. Cornfields with monocrops of maize, horizons punctuated by silos. I mean, there's nothing natural, you know, and yet it's so recent, you know. So this is where our species, it's the weakest and the strongest part of our species adaptation. And in a way, I think what's happened is that, you know, what is weird is that, you know, evolution happens at a very slow pace, but the technological wizardry unleashed by our species is consuming the world at a tremendous pace. So the only thing that's going to, and it's also given us great gifts, but the only thing that's going to curtail this hell-bent for destruction path that we clearly are on at some level is if we can use our intelligence and intellectual ingenuity to shift this current of history. You know, evolution won't have time to do it. You know, we'll have to think our way out of this problem. And the great optimistic thing is the old saying that the Stone Age didn't end when you ran out of stones. You know, the oil age isn't going to end when we run out of hydrocarbons. You know, the great hope for the world, and truly the great hope for America, is the only thing that can continue to spark the imagination of this country in a way that will allow it to continue to be a legitimate leader in the world, and that's the greening of the economy. You know, no other country is as equipped as the United States, despite the recent economic meltdown. It still has the ingenuity, the culture of risk-taking, the resources and the capacity to lead the way in the greening of the world's economy. If Bush at 9/11, instead of clearly fueling the flames of fear by declaring war on an abstraction, terrorism, if he instead had stood up on the rubble of the World Trade Center and said, "This is never going to happen again. I will never again let a commodity with an unnaturally high value dominate our world. We will not allow a bunch of, klepto, dictators from the Middle East just because they happen to be born in sands. You know what I mean? Yeah. We will never allow this to happen again. We will not, I'm not deluding you. We're not going to become fully energy independent, but we will reduce our capacity, increase our capabilities in terms of alternative energies, with the goal of reaching the moon in a decade. We did it once before. We've got a kind of new moon to reach. If we had done that, think of how different this decade would have been. There would have been no Iraq war. There would have been no, if anything, the price of oil would have declined. The economy would have grown with the incredible investment into the greening. I mean, if we do greening the economy, just think about it. It's going to make the IT revolution look trivial. I mean, every part of our infrastructure is going to have to change, and that's what's going to allow this country to reassert itself, because that level of ingenuity, of freedom of thinking, is something that I do not think the Chinese, for example, have culturally and politically.
Which is why you're here.
Which is why I live in the States. You live in the States because It's the best of all things and the worst of all things,
Yeah.
but it's the States, you know.
Yes.
It's an amazing place.
So unless
What we need to do is make this a country of Walt Whitman and the Grateful Dead again.
So unless that happens, unless we get into that paradigm again, we have an agreeing with the economy, do you feel that the ancient prophecies of the Mayans and whoever else have substance? Do you feel that there's something?
Well, one of the things I'm very careful about is, I so respect the integrity of cultures that, I never, if what I say about cultures is even half true, these aren't ideas or beliefs that you can try on like a cloak. In other words, people have always said to me, like, particularly because of the voodoo books, well, did you become possessed? Well, if they knew anything about me, they would know that I would never become possessed. Not only out of respect for the traditions, but because I think so. I so believe that spirit possession is real, but it can only be real if and it's so complicated in terms of the psychological, physiological elements. It's something that has to be in the fiber of your being. You can't just try it on like a cloak. And by the same token, I don't believe in universal. I believe in universal messages. I don't believe in universal kind of predictors like prophecy. Like I don't even know what that Mayan prophecy really is about. I mean, you remember we had that whole thing, the world, and people are given to megalomaniacal kind of fantasies. I mean, we even did it with the Y2K thing at the turn of the century, and what was it? The Mayan. There was that big Mayan thing that was supposed to happen. I kind of think they're kind of the products of people on too many drugs. To be honest with you, I mean, it's sort of like the thing about the plants and Mozart. The richness and the complexity of the human condition and the human beliefs and the human spirit cannot be readily reduced to kind of pan-continental hippie ideas. I mean, it just doesn't work that way. But doesn't mean I'm not being dismissive of people who find solace in such ideas. But I don't really believe in universal fantasies, or I don't believe in universal possibilities. I mean, the whole richness is that what the Maya believed was a product of the Maya, and stays with the Maya, and we don't even know who the Maya really were. I mean, hell, until 20 years ago, we thought it was called classic Maya, Tikal, for example, Chichen Itza, was the height of Mayan worldview. Now it's pretty well clear from excavations at places like Mirador by Richard Hansen, and that probably the height of the Maya era was 1,000 years before the time of Christ. I mean, when we can't even settle on that, let alone having any understanding of how they disappeared, how on earth can we project notions of a Mayan prophecy that's just been drawn from the ether by some well-intentioned. The terrible thing about the New Age movement is its credo is, if I believe it, it's true, and becomes profoundly kind of anti-intellectual. And it's obviously a movement that, especially in its heyday, was a reactionary movement. It was a reaction against the excessive Descartian, deterministic, positivist lineage of the 19th century. Where all, I mean, this is really where the West really, I think, took a descent from the Enlightenment, because the positivist tradition was really when we began to say, if phenomena can't be measured and observed, they can't exist. So all notions of metaphor, magic, mysticism that had in various ways propelled the human species for most of our history were kind of tossed out, and we didn't realize that faith, for example, or belief in spirit or God or whatever, it didn't matter whether it was true or not. It was a blanket of comfort that gave solace to people in a very troubling universe. And so, when we threw out all openness to faith, magic, mysticism, we also gave up, the comfort of certainty and the comfort of understanding, and in a way cast ourselves adrift in what became the kind of hallmark of modernity, which is the isolation of the individual, sociologically, spiritually, even politically, and often economically, you know. And this is one of the, it's not even a crisis of modernity, it's a condition of modernity, you know, which again is not particularly normal in the affairs of human beings. I mean, it's not really normal to live 3,000 miles from your parents and move 1,500 miles before you bother to tell them. You know, we do it all the time.
All the time.
Good.
Thank you, thank you.
You
Let's have
bet.
a couple of shots outside and we're